This final session is going to feature about 15 or so minutes of remarks by our visiting scholar and discussant, Elaine Heumann Gurian, followed by a more open discussion among all of the panelists. And I will let you know in advance that Gunter has a plane to catch, so he is not leaving in a huff at the end of the session. But if anyone wants to ask him a particularly difficult question at about 12 minutes to 5, he can make a really dynamic exit. And as soon as we end here at about 5 o'clock, there will be a reception and more food across the hall. So I'm delighted to introduce Elaine Gurian. This is her third visit to the Museum Studies program. She is a friend to us all, so I will not give her a long introduction, except to say that she is a consultant, writer, longtime leader in the museum field, and one of the best and most serious thinkers about museums. So we're delighted to have her with us.
What a wonderful day. We should, all of us, of course, start with thank yous. So let's thank first Carla and Brad and Amy and Emma for producing this incredible day. Let's thank their choice of wonderful speakers. They were absolutely right. These are wonderful speakers, so thank you very much, all of you, for coming. And for me, most importantly, I want to thank Layla's mom, who I've never met before. But all of us wish that our moms were here to see what successes we are. So thank you very much for coming. You sat through a very long day, so I'm going to try not to tell you what you have already heard, but to try and make some sense of what you've already heard in some form that's usable. And let me warn my panelists up here, what I'm going to ask them is what I usually ask my students, which is, what surprised you? What did you learn? And what are you going to take home that you didn't know that you were going to take home with you? So get ready. My review is going to go as follows. It's about data sets, data manipulation, learning, the scholar researcher, the student helper, next steps, and what if we don't? So what you've listened to is, at least for me, enormous data sets, gigantic amount of information being downloaded. We're already tired being on the internet with enormous data sets. And not to get overwhelmed by it all, but to start to think about how we're going to use it and what we can use it for. Our panelists have all given us many, many opportunities about how it is that we can make sense of data sets. But the first part begins with openness and the ethics of openness. And I hope, I'm not going to name all my panelists, but I hope they hear that I was listening. So if you think it's about you, it is. It's also about, and this is the most critical issue, it's about the non-openness of things like copyright and things tied to promotion and the underlying culture of knowledge hoarding that all of us have been trained in. And in the end, this is about culture shift, and culture shift that turns out to be incredibly important in a school of knowledge, in a school of learning, in a school of training, and in a school in which new knowledge is created for others. When you listen to the first person, what you realized is the way in which our institutions are planning to deal with the other side of downloading our data sets is probably the critical ethical question of our time. Data manipulation. One of the things that we've looked at and has been an issue forever is it reproducible? Is the system itself understandable? If we create systems that are unique to us, can we get people to understand how they work? And there were words about endless reproducible systems or systems that are available that we understand how to use, so that the beginning of citizen relationship to it happens with, can we learn how to use the system? One of the things we learned also is, once we start to use the system, the fact that the citizens are using the system, or that the system has built-in feedback, is generating knowledge that evidently would never have been done before without the technology itself. So one of the things I was struck with is that technology and its opportunity is creating new knowledge, that is its own capacity, if we want to make use of it. And especially in the last one that Gunther did, one of the things he kept stressing was that we can do stuff here that we never could do before. That was true when the telephone came. It was true when the car came. It's not news, but you saw many, many different ways in which our participation with the knowledge then makes the knowledge new knowledge. We are generating in the collective new knowledge in ways that were not true before. I am particularly interested in the citizen effort. There are lots of people who write about it, in the people who write about technology and sociology together, or the change in which our thinking is happening. So this dialogue between downloading the data set, which we own, and having people start to access it who then make use of it for their own use, but who, out of a certain kind of generosity, because we have put it into the system, start to feed back to others who make use of it in other ways. That is a citizen effort, and it builds community by itself and a kind of peaceability and civility that I'm interested in. We should not minimize the fact that the people who have access to this are themselves on their own quest, and on their own quest are willing to help others by uploading what it is that they have gotten themselves. We started to talk about data as artifact itself. I'm reminded of the Yad Vashem is a museum in Israel that decided never to have any collections, and they had models of Jewish architecture, but the models were so gorgeous that they accessioned them, and they are their only collections. In this case, what we were talking about was data sets, and the visualization that are coming up are in fact analogs to artifacts themselves, and in many cases are artifacts. There are artists now playing with artifacts as artistic presentation, and we should begin to think about what is real and what is not real, which we are thinking about, but we should begin to think of these not real as artifacts and start to think about how it is we in the museum people deal with it. Therefore, we're really talking about new definitions of real and new definitions of artifacts. And I'm harken back to the beginning of museums. We used to have plaster casts, which are now in the attics. And when I'm really lucky, I get taken to them. Plaster casts of the pyramids, of the Sphinx. They were actual plaster casts, which were considered artifacts and real, no longer. So we have a long history of changing our definition of artifacts. The thing I really took away here was about learning. The people who are doing work on the differentiation of learning that's happening with technology, both for our students and not, struck me here. And the big thing that struck me was, we talk about the pre-visit, the visit, and the post-visit. What we're really talking about is learning over time. And therefore, people who are interacting with our data sets are in certain ways making friends with the data. And when they come to visit their friend, the animal, their friend, the artwork, we have changed something about the threshold fear that I write about entering an obscure and terrifying institution because they are going to visit their friend. And therefore, we should start to think about this learning trajectory that starts with the computer, also ends with the computer, and at some point interacts with the evidence, as a long and continuing piece of learning, and not one that we're looking at, not one where we're thinking that they are making friends and breaking down barriers. We are also not paying attention to the quest behavior, which is one of my absolute favorites. People are doing things because they are on a personal quest. And when we download data sets, which have no judgment about them, but broad ability to use them, people have quest behavior. That is, they're putting it together in different ways. That's what Pinterest is about, which is one of the things I care about. That's what Flickr is about. Because other people then learn from the ways in which people have put it together on their own quest. There is now academic work being done about the intuitive archiving that is going on in Pinterest as a way of looking at new ways to separate objects and new ways to set up archival taxonomies. The intuitive taxonomies that we are using on personal quests then turn out to be useful ways in which other people are interested in doing that. It's also one of the things is that it's completely non-judgmental. I set up my quest, my Pinterest board, and no one says, oh no, not academic. They say, they don't care. Nor do they care that my Pinterest board is a melange of things I'm learning and places I want to go and clothes I might want to buy. They don't care. So the personhood is completely accepted and the learning is transferable. And what it does, among other things, is build community. These are community of unknown people with unknown people, but I have people I follow. I don't know their names. I don't care to know their names. I can know their names as an identifier to find them. But they are my friends. They are my colleagues. We are teaching each other. So this downloading of the data set then offers a way in which other people start to build knowledge, and their knowledge starts to increase our general knowledge and generosity, but they build their own community as well. This will mean that we are willing to decouple the downloading of the data from our hoarding of the information that we have about it. And one of the things I liked very much was this notion of nuance and continuum, because in fact this is not a free-for-all. There are edges, and the edges are determined individual by individual or institution by institution, but they start with a mindset of generosity, and they put in reluctantly the edges rather than, of course, the edges. And they start with the assumption that the users are their colleagues and their equals, at least in humanity, not that they are their students and need to be reprimanded. And this tonal issue is an exceedingly important one. So therefore, we have a huge cultural change that we need to do. Because if we have, for example, as universities have, a promotion that's based on individual acquisition of information and then the control of that information, and as Ray pointed out, the publication of that information in a jury journal by our peers, our need to be generous is reduced because it's not in our self-interest. So the carrot of our generosity needs to be played larger and larger. We need to change promotion. We need to link databases. We need to look at reproducibility of the database process. And one of the things people started to talk about is in our museums, we need to establish what really was very Victorian, and that is visual storage in which we are not necessarily making judgments, but are offering a huge data set that's both visual and the capacity in our visitation for people to make sense of it and then to share it back. There was a big conversation about readiness, and I don't know quite what readiness yet means if we're going to relinquish control and be generous. Are our collections ready? Is our data ready? Is our conservation ready Do we have it in formats that other people can use? It's a very big project. But it's also a project that needs a mindset change, because readiness means readiness for new systems and new system availability. Probably when we put the data together, we didn't know about these systems, and so we have to be familiar enough with the systems to look at what readiness might mean. No one talked today about monetization, private-public partnerships, or indeed, what are we doing with the commercial world? Thank you, Google, for not monetizing it yet, or maybe never, let us hope. But that notion about the generosity in a capitalist system where we are all fragile economically means that we have to rethink some very base issues. And what if we don't? Well, you heard today that if you have digital artwork and the art museums aren't ready for you, you establish a parallel universe. And that's what will happen. If the museums and the museum-like institutions are really not a responsive institution, we just establish parallel universe. On top of it, those universes are established all the time. When Saddam Hussein was executed, there was the official movie of his execution, and there was the sneaked-in iPhone actual version, which forced governments to change their mind about the official execution. Because the parallel universe is not in our control. Everyone is carrying a documenter in the form of an iPhone in their pocket. We don't want to be overwhelmed. We don't want to be overwhelmed by others. And that means, I think, that we have to be excited about this new reinvention of the museum staff, the museum's content, and our relationship with community. One of the things that people always ask me is, do I think because you can download this in your room that it's the end of the social space and therefore the end of the museum? And my answer is quite the contrary. Human beings need to be in their private spaces, which give them pleasure and comfort, and they equally, biologically, need to be in the place with others. We are, in some form, pack animals. And the relationship between the private space and the public space is within our control, and how we link them is going to be part of our reinvention. And in the end, the most important thing for me is nuance. It isn't either or, folks. It's both and. Thanks. Your turn. What did you learn? What are you surprised about? And what are you taking home?
I suppose what I'm taking home, honestly, is that we've been focusing very much on the institutional side of the equation. But I think that we can also start looking more at the audience explicitly and making the institutions aware of their audience online in ways that we haven't been so far. And perhaps that will motivate change a little bit more rapidly. When we start exposing the real behaviors of their audience, and when we start showing how broad of a reach their content might have, that might provoke change.
One of the things I didn't talk about, but you remind me, is that this porousness now between expertise and personal knowledge is going away because we have vehicles in which we can share that information, and we're not talking about that enough either. Other people, what are you taking home?
I'm taking home a desire to have one of those 3D scan bots. I really want one of those. More seriously, I was clearly a sort of skeptic, but I was really encouraged by Google's stance on sort of cultural patrimony and copyright and stuff like that. It was very nice to see.
I'd like to say something about what I was surprised about. So as a person who designs and builds software, it's been drilled into my head that in in fact, if you build it, people are likely not to come. And I just thought it was so fantastic to see, especially in Tanya's project, how many people were really making use of the tool set that they've made available to these learners. And not just using it, but using it in an authentic way that's going to lead these learners directly into these communities of practice. I mean, it's providing these credentialing needs, it's providing opportunities for contact with experts in the field. I just thought it was just heartening to see that can happen.
You know, I often feel like you hear with sort of a mindset of the question you're sitting with, and the question I'm sitting with is a question about scale, and so a lot of what I hear sort of feeds into me trying to tease out that question. And so when Peter was talking, he's really talking about scale. You know, how can we release value of these collections, international collections, worldwide collections, this cultural heritage at scale, so it's not segregated as we have institutionally segregated. And then Ethan was talking about scalability. I don't think you used the word, but really openness translates into scalability at the end of the day. So I'm thinking a lot about scale. You know, you've heard it in my talk. You know, how can you scale up digitization to certain levels and so on and so forth. And then on the other hand, there's a counterbalance to that, where on the one hand, there are the huge numbers, and somehow we got to figure out how to do that. On the other hand, then there are the very, very individual experiences that you talked about. You know, how do you make something meaningful that's as concrete as that single data point? It's not a single data point. As that curve that you were trying to have people understand. And what I'm trying to figure out is how do those two go together? You know, on the one hand, there's this massive scale. On the other hand, there's got to be meaningful interaction with every single point in that massive scale. And how do we do that? You know, how do we have millions, potentially billions of things and have experiences for every single one of them that is as immersive and as meaningful as the experience you created for these kids? And it's a really tough question to me. That's an unsolved nut, an uncracked nut.
I would say that what I take home is inspiration. And I also recently, I've been thinking a lot about this museums and biological collections in particular, and there's a huge effort now to digitize biological collections. So there's and what I would say in response in some ways even to this scale versus the individual experience perspective is that I think this all comes down to building stories, because we are human and we respond to stories, and so I think that the trick is going to be how do we take all of these amazing resources that we're creating and build that into the fabric of the humans that discovered them, collected them, curated them, or just interacted with them. And I think we can do that in sort of a hierarchical way. Maybe this is just a blatant pandering to Carla, but sort of weaving things together, weaving together in a hierarchical way all of these different objects through their relationships.
One of the things that I didn't say but meant to was the acquisitiveness of the collectors that many of us are the recipient of. In the technologic world, the acquisitiveness is free, but it's the same issue. So making sense of data sets allows you to be acquisitive. In fact, in Pinterest, they call you a curator, which I find weird, but there it is. But this notion of it's mine comes, I think, from a long and probably biological need, but data sets allow you to reproduce that without you actually owning it. And it is maybe one of the ways in which we can start to look at kind of sociologic use of we'll shop less and we'll collect more online, or I don't know what will happen, but this notion of using it for my own need in the shape I wish to use it, I think is worth thinking of more. It's all your turn. Ask anybody you want about anything you want.
Some topics are off topic.
Oh, no, I'm not on anything you want to. I got, and the nuance, get yourself to the edge, that's all.
I was surprised at how good the coffee was. As far as using all this data and whether it's actual physical data or representational data, I guess aiding and benefiting more exposure, such as cultural repatriation through through data exchange. I don't know if that's been an issue for particularly the professor there, or has it come up in academia or in any other spheres?
I'm not quite sure particularly where you want to take that question, but we have a great repatriation story to tell in the 3D realm. One of the objects we captured and as part of the release is a killer whale hat from the Tlingit tribe in Alaska. And the tribe asked for the object back under the Repatriation Act, and they received the object back. On the deathbed of the clan leader, he received the object back. Very dramatic story. And then the tribe heard that we have this capability to 3D scan items, and they actually brought the object back to the Smithsonian to have it 3D scanned so the Smithsonian could create a replica of it at the museum so we could tell the story, so we could still tell the story about the tribe and about the object and the incredible nature of it, while the tribe actually held the original. And as part of that repatriation and the recreation of the Tlingit hat, killer whale hat, as a 3D, it was CNC machined, it wasn't printed, as a CNC machined object that was then hand painted. The tribe also reserved the right to dance that hat and use it in ceremonial functions. So whenever they come to DC, they dance both the original hat and the reproduced hat. And it's an incredible story of reconciling sort of both worlds, the museum interest in telling a story and highlighting a story, and the tribe's interest in having the objects that rightfully belong to them back. Don't know whether that hit you, but I heard the word repatriation, so I thought I'd tell the story.
Fun. Thank you.
I think I'm struck by the paradoxes and the ambiguity that so many of you have talked about today. You know, the pull between openness and ownership, and between massive data sets and individual experiences. And as you summed it up, Elaine, that it's both and. And I think this is something that's going on in a lot of realms right now. I and one of my colleagues have been doing this deep dive into creativity at the Denver Art Museum. And after 18 months of both qualitative and quantitative studies, we keep coming up with all of these examples of paradox. And the staff teams that have been grappling with this for all of that time are finally starting to embrace that and say, yes, this is what it's about. So, you know, maybe that applies to technology too, that it's so new, and yet a lot of these issues, like you said, Elaine, go back to plaster casts. It's just a different kind of what's real and what's virtual. So thank you for reminding us of that.
Hi everyone, my name is Marika. Thank you so much for your time today. So I've worked in museums that are chronically underfunded, don't have any resources, and the sorts of projects that you mentioned are figments of our imagination, they're dreams. I guess maybe a question for all of you, how would you convince management, board members to devote resources to gathering data, and especially when they say, can you get an intern to do it, something like that.
So I have a very specific example of how to do it, and I want to riff again on the prototypes. All you need to do is, in order to convince somebody, is that something should be done in a programmatic fashion, is you have to show them one instance of it being done that is so compelling that they can't walk away from it. And with 3D data, it's actually really easy. Take a collection object, take an iPad, download an app called 123D Catch, capture images of this collection object. It automatically computes the 3D image and then show it to somebody. That's a very, very cheap way to get started in having a conversation about what this could mean to your institution. And there's many sort of low threshold and low investment ways to then build on that. It doesn't have to be super high end and super expensive to have a big impact.
Pretty much what I was going to say.
Also an appetite maybe for failure.
Yeah.
I mean, in the sense that failing quickly is fine, and especially if you do it very cheaply or free, that's even better. So, yeah, I mean, just being open to that idea that it's not going to be perfect the first time or the first 100 times, but at least if you give it a shot and start that conversation, you'll have somewhere to go with that rather than this abstract, we have all these barriers. If you knock any of those out of the way, you're at least advancing that.
Ethan showed us all these logos of what are essentially free platforms. And those of us who are individuals who are uploading to Pinterest or are uploading to Flickr are essentially uploading to free platforms. So the capacity to demonstrate any of the ideas or even to demonstrate building community is available without, God knows if it will remain available, but at this moment in our lives, there are a lot of free platforms and very low-cost apps in which whole sets of behaviors start to change in your museum because of it.
I'd say, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, make sure that you're not just doing it for the technology. Don't be seduced by having a 3D image, but make sure there's an intentionality behind that. What are we going to do with this? Because that makes the difference between the wow and the so what.
I'd say, so I got three. I got, don't reinvent the wheel. There's no need to build something new from the ground up, from scratch, if it already exists. Two, iterate openly. So do your work in such a way that other people can benefit from it, and also potentially say, well, we had that problem too. We did. And three, collaborate. Look for opportunities to collaborate with other resource poor institutions. That we have this, you got this. Maybe we can team up and build something together.
I'd like to add my own plug to that, actually. Don't forget about students. A lot of these, some of the things you'll want to do are known problems, and for those, it's really more of a training opportunity than anything else. So I know there are lots of students who would like to get experience with, say, cleaning up 3D scan data. And maybe you can even make use of an institution like the University of Michigan if they have these resources available to you. Strike up some sort of a partnership there. But you can also, for the type of work that I do, which tends to be pretty creative and inventive, there are lots of students out there who are dying for an opportunity to build something cool. And you would not believe, and I've done this for more years than I want to say now, how hard it is to get a foot in the door with a lot of informal institutions. People are just scared or not interested. Be open to letting people come in and trying to do something new in your space, and you'll be really surprised and often pleased. There'll probably be some quick failures in the process, but you'll often be really surprised by what can happen and how that might change your the leadership and the way that they're viewing the presence of digital activities inside an institution.
We have time for one or two more questions, and then we're feeding you.
I've got a nice broad question. You've managed to very successfully get us invested in your research and in your work today. We want to know what next steps are for you. If we had you back here in 2 years, what would you tell us that you've been working on in the 2-year period in between? Tanya?
Someone else mentioned monetization. I think Elaine, you said, is it not? So we are actually working on yet another use of the database is a commercial one essentially, because we have been very fortunate in having NSF funding consistently since 1995, but that is not typical and that's not something to rely on. So because we've now built this large database, we're working on ways to use those data and create services that we can then generate revenue from. And believe me, it's a difficult paradigm shift. It's extremely difficult, and we are very much intent to keep the data open. We believe in open data, but we also have to be sustainable. So we're having to be very creative in thinking about what are the unique features that we have that nobody else has, and how can we use them. And in terms of the openness, it struck me as well that we're all about open source and sharing data and making it available to the public. But when you enter the sort of business realm, which you have to, they tell you don't talk about your innovations. Don't share this information because it is proprietary. So it's a very difficult balance. But how else do you survive?
I think creating cultural experiences over the next few years, the question is in terms of what we're thinking about. I think creating cultural experiences where people aren't expecting to interact with culture. So just to make it more pervasive and to permeate more of your natural interactions with technology. So every time you see a logo, why don't you also see a painting? Or every time you see an advertisement, why can't you see a sculpture? Or, in terms of make it just as easy to come across objects from institutions and from cultural heritage institutions, have that be just as pervasive as any other kind of image online would be kind of interesting to see. That and jetpacks.
This is kind of childish of me to say, but I have no damn clue. I mean, I'm having too much fun doing what I'm doing now. Look that far in the future.
Goodness, too many things are really on my mind right now, but I certainly am interested in following up on integrating mobile support tools for interpreters, as I mentioned. I'm also gotten increasingly interested in engaging kids, not necessarily in science processes, but also engineering processes as well, because it's a slightly different way of thinking through things. The skill sets you develop are slightly different. Your perceptions are slightly different when you're approaching things from an engineering perspective as opposed to a scientific research perspective. And I think that's been underexplored, and it seems ripe for interaction design.
Brad, one of the things that my colleagues haven't talked about is that the big growth industry is also maker, hands-on, really doing stuff. And the interaction between what is being downloaded and the doing, which we got to see a little that Layla is going to do, is in fact going to happen a lot, where you can't solve the problem without both doing it and having access to the database, where this is going to be a both and that children are going to think of it as really an ordinary thing to do. It won't be the simulation only of playing tennis, it will be playing tennis and a database. And that notion that it's about to merge the real hands-on and the real database, I think is good. There's lots of little experiments, but I think it's going to grow much bigger. So that's enough for everybody. Go drink and be merry, and thank you for coming, and thank you all the people who made this possible.